Donc après cette entrée par le contexte français, je vais maintenant donner la parole à Danièle Joly, qui est professeure à l'université de Warwick et que nous avons la chance d'avoir encore plus près de nous depuis quelque temps au Cadiz, où elle est donc Marie Curie Fellow. Danièle propose une vue comparée entre la France et l'Angleterre. Hier, tu voulais parler de la participation politique et civique des femmes de culture musulmane en France et en Angleterre, mais je crois que tu as aussi un peu transformé ton papier pour ce panel. Donc, je te laisse la parole.
Bonjour, comme Alexandra vous l'a dit, ma présentation se base sur un large projet de recherche qui a été lancé depuis l'université de Warwick, mais auquel nous avons associé le Cadiz, et en particulier Alexandra, ici présente, sur la participation civique et politique des femmes de culture musulmane. Alors, je m'empresse de définir ce que j'entends par culture musulmane. C'est dans le sens plus sociologique, comme l'entendent les Anglais. Ah, I'm supposed to speak in English, sorry. So it's in the sociological sense, meaning as it's normally accepted in Britain, which is people whose family origins lie in countries where Islam is the majority religion. So it's not necessarily people who practice or believe, but it includes them also. And that's applied for the research in France and Britain. Another concept that I wish to outline is the difference I established between categorization, stemming from the dominant out-group, and self-definition, which is formulated by the in-group. But of course, there's an interaction between the two. They crisscross and interconnect. The methodological approach is drawn from Margaret Archer. Ah, you don't hear me? I need to speak like this. Well, the methodological approach is that based on Margaret Archer, who gives us a methodological tool to investigate the interaction between structure and agency. And she develops themes like cultural and structural emergent properties and a situational guidance, which is provided for the subjects to engage into action, individual or collective action. But in the first instance, I shall posit my epistemological position regarding racism and Islamophobia. Well, in my view, they both pertain to the same process of social construction and negative categorization. In other words, they both involve the naturalization and essentialization of characteristics, of innate negative characteristics and connotations, whether they be phenotypical, cultural, religious, ethnic. It's all avatars of the same species in my view. And it leads certain groups to being marginalized, excluded, discriminated, inferiorized, dehumanized, and even can reach the extremes of genocide. So that, in my view, we have specific historically determined markers that select groups and characteristics, which will lead me to a historical view. I shall try and make it brief, but inevitably it's historically dependent. And the first stage of racism and racist ideology that was developed was tied up with scientifically based racism, so-called scientifically based racism at the service of colonization. And the reason why I mention it is because the population that we have studied are people, women, coming from countries which were former colonies, and thereafter populations that settled in France and Britain. So it's important to take that on board and look at the first stages of installation and how it provided a framework that presided over the kind of action, the kind of engagement the women could take part in. Because this is what we're looking at. We're looking at the subject viewpoint of why and how and what they engaged in. And so what is very clear is what I call, for want of for short, biological racism. The biologically constructed racism presides over the first period of installation after World War II, with all the racist attributes that are the inheritance of colonialism. And of course, they were invented by a Frenchman called the Comte de Gobineau, who started measuring cranes and other features to prove that the Aryans were superior to other races. And this was taken up by the theorists of colonization and later on by the theorists of Nazism and also of apartheid, not to forget. But in any case, the women will be faced, like the groups they belong to this type of racism and discrimination in all domains of the public space, be it accommodation, schooling, employment, the usage of public spaces and institutions. And the women we have interviewed document that period, where they had to face being chartered onto technological path at school in England, in secondary modern schools that prepared workers for the factory, basically, for instance, and others in the domain of accommodation or in teaching, where they would be side-passed by a white competitor. But what happens is that this in Britain generated an incredibly mass movement, potent mass movement in all shapes and forms through participation in associations, campaigns, demonstrations, picketing the public, the pubs or the restaurants that didn't allow non-whites in. And this enormous mobilization was basically race and class based. There was a very strong class determinant to it, which means that they also allied with the left of the Labour Party at the time in Britain. And there was absolutely no input of the religious marker at that time. And women we interviewed, some of them participated in this kind of movement, in particular Zarina, who tells us how she took part with her husband, but surpassed him very rapidly to become main leader of the black sections of the Labour Party, who took part in supporting the miners' strike, in all the campaigns against racism and discrimination, took part in support for the Irish struggle and trade union struggles. So this kind of situational guidance led the women who were present at the time, though in Britain they would have arrived later than other groups, took part in this mainstream struggle as part of a citizenry. But to remember that in Britain, all the Commonwealth subjects all had British citizenship and could fully participate in all aspects of the polity and political life and could form associations. Now, it installed a culture of participation which was quite significant. At a later stage, it led to very strong anti-discriminatory legislation, 1976 Race Relations Act, and the Commission for Racial Equality, which, to be compared to the HCI, there is a chasm between the two, because it actually did combat racism. But it established a framework within which there was a recognition of difference and pretty strong legislation and policies against racist discrimination, which most of the women interviews of that generation stressed, that it awarded them actual rights and the possibility of fighting for more. And it involved also a culture of participation, which was very important and remains still today. In France, the same period, the same parallel period, displays a different picture, because there are two structural factors that militate against a similar mass movement against racism. One is the fact that those migrants didn't have the right to vote, didn't have any political or social right, or the right to form associations until 1981. And the second was that racism was fed and stoked by the Algerian War. And a great number of discriminatory acts, including murders, took place, which led, as we are celebrating this year, to the La Marche pour l'Égalité. And in fact, many of the women of that generation that we interviewed celebrated and appreciated that movement to which they took part. And they said that it provided them with a launching pad into full participation in mainstream society. They took part in all the movements against racism, in the MRAP, SOS Racisme, the campaign Touche pas mon pote, but also this led them into broader involvement in the polity, in the political arena and other spheres. Islam was not on the agenda still then. The difference with Britain is that only very mitigated success was scored, as it was not profound nor long-term. And this type of racism persists today, and it's evidenced by several of the women that we've talked to, the racism based on color, so-called race, appearance. But it has been superseded by, like a palimpsest, it has not disappeared, but it has been superseded by what we call, what sociologists and some other people, some sociologists call Islamophobia. Islamophobia makes an appearance, strong appearance, towards the end of the 1990s in France and Britain, though prior to that there had been a kind of process of what I call self-definition, of Muslims claiming some space for themselves in France and Britain. In France, more harbingers, because the whole participatory movement was delayed by 20 years for the factors I mentioned, such as the Algerian War. In Britain, one can say that Muslims have established for themselves a place for Muslims in British society. I don't have the time to go into detail, but there was a kind of institutionalization of Islam, having a presence in the public space. There are a number of factors that explain it, and I can go into it if you want at some point, but it is pretty well documented that compared to France, Islam made a place for itself in British wider society, in the polity, in institutions. Nonetheless, the categorization that arises through this new social construction against Islam is a negative one. Altogether, Muslim being portrayed as cruel, intolerant, anti-democracy, repressive of women, archaic, and the like. I'm sure I don't need to go into details about it. But what I need to add is that there are gender-specific stereotypes and attributes that the women have evidenced, and of course, which they are perceived, and this is a great impediment to their participation, is that they are perceived as passive, submissive, homebound mothers and wives. For instance, Rukaya in Britain, who gives birth to a child, in hospital, leaves after giving birth, and the nurse says to her, "See you next year, darling." And of course, the woman is a very high-grade social worker and has no intention of producing 10 children because she has a mother's life and a wife's life and a professional life and a political life. And there are several more examples. In France, Raya, who tells us, well, black women are always mistaken for cleaners. This is what everybody thinks I am all the time. She's a PhD student. This is quite a strong impediment to their participation in wider society, this assumption that they will correspond to the stereotype. And if they wear a headscarf, it emphasizes the point that they conform to this formatting. Now, the rise of Islamophobia in France and Britain involves interconnected national and international processes. International with the events of the Twin Towers, 9/11. Now, in Britain, it had a huge impact and led Tony Blair at some point to state that Islam was similar to communism, Islam having become the new public enemy #1 internationally. But nationally, it followed different courses, and I will start with the nationally constructed Islamophobia in France. The 9/11 events of 2001 had less of an impact than in Britain, for it was not a watershed as it was in Britain. For obvious reasons, France didn't intervene in Iraq, for instance, and did not identify with the Bush war on terror as Britain did, the Bush-Blair alliance. It still fed a good security agenda and gave nice justification for it, and some anti-terror security measures. But the real nexus of Islamophobia in France was a national affair. The issue of Islam is a national affair more than an international affair in France. It was instrumentalized by politicians as an ideological weapon to pursue their electoral gains and to to harvest votes away from the National Front, the Front National, etc. And Islamophobia has reached untold heights in France, whereby not long ago this 34 Ipsos opinion poll documented that 74% of French people thought Islam and France were incompatible. So what do? Do we send them to the sea, or like Isabelle la Catholique, do we ask them to convert to, I'm not sure what. In any case, the main ideological tool that was seized upon, as was mentioned prior to my talk, was laïcité. Laïcité erected, as the Stasi report, as Stasi declared at the time studied the Stasi report, to the rank of a founding value. It became a very strong ideological weapon, which turned Muslim women into hostages. They became hostages of this ideological tug of war. Now, this is very serious because at the nexus of Islam, there was a dress code, and it was erected into the ultimate symbolical value that would determine whether you were French or not, for want of a better word. And the main issue that it focused on was on education. Education, which is also a major way for social mobility, for autonomy for women, who use education as a main weapon of autonomy, not only Muslim women, but other women too, non-Muslim. And with the two laws of 2004 against the scarf, the headscarf in school, in 2010 against the total face concealment in public spaces, it was very clear that Islam was targeted, Muslims were targeted, and that women became the hostage of this ideological war. It produced a number of unintended and intended side effects. One, it created a polarization and a cleavage among the women. It created a situational guidance that obliged them to make a choice. Yes? So they had to make a choice between ranking with the law or against the law. It created a cleavage among the Muslim community, people of Muslim background, even those who were not necessarily active practicing Muslims, all had to make a decision. And there were mobilization acts like l'école pour tous et pour toutes, etc. But the most serious side effect is the impediments, the structural and cultural impediment created for the full participation in mainstream society of women who decided to wear this dress code. What Margaret Archer calls structural and cultural emergent properties. It also had other insidious effects. One which became, and we mentioned before, a colonization of the mind and a colonization of institutions, with an assumption, a presumption that the headscarf would be unwelcome everywhere, even where it was not legally prohibited. In addition, it creates a more insidious internalization on the part of the women who wouldn't even dare engage in a number of activities on the assumption that they would not be welcome if they wore a headscarf, even if they might have been. And finally, it reinforced gender discrimination because they were more visible than men and would be the more immediate target of the hostility, developing hostility against Muslims. And finally, a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if it's portrayed that Islam is repressing women and keeping them at home, barring them from school will surely send them back home. In France, what happened as a consequence has been a division of the anti-racist movement and the anti-Islamophobia movement. And I think this is a serious question we need to address and investigate furthermore. I'll have 2 minutes to speak about Britain. In Britain, a different itinerary was followed by Islamophobia. The 9/11 events of the Twin Towers and the 7/7 events of the suicide bombing in England struck fear among the British establishment and the Muslim communities. And it engineered a great number of anti-terrorist legislation and policies, raids, arrests, and so on. I could give you figures and details on that. It changed the Muslims into suspect communities. The English Defence League mobilized on the strength that they were all terrorists, but also represented a menace on British culture. However, a very unintended consequence of this whole framework was an incredible upsurge of activism on the part of Muslim women. It created a window of opportunity for Muslim women who engaged fully, initially, in the Stop the War coalition, which was not launched by Muslims. It was launched by the left-wing opposition to the Labour Party. And a great sense of outrage, which women were very sensitive to, in terms of the injustice of that war and that intervention, led them to embark in a massive participation in the Stop the War coalition, whereby the leader of the Stop the War coalition was a young woman of Muslim background, a PhD student, and very many secretaries of sections, regional or local, were young women who had been educated in Britain but decided to take it upon themselves to engage. And it was an exponential expansion because they then created associations, engaged in more political participation in all aspects of British society, and really were launched on a course which was almost, I would say, almost irreversible. As it happens, it's an enormous paradox because the anti-terror measures, of course, repressed Muslims and changed them into suspect communities. But the government, struck with awe at the announcement of these suicide bombings in Britain on the part of inbred young people that didn't come from outside, suddenly realized that they could seek interlocutors who were not traditional ethnic or Muslim leaders, old males who kept women out, but that's the conclusion. Engage with women and poured quite a lot of funding through a controversial program called Prevent. But the women seized upon it, and I think are continuing now, despite the ebb engineered by the Cameron government. The only word I will say as a conclusion is that the Islamophobia in England seems to have helped women, Muslim women, although it was certainly not planned. In France has been a disservice to Muslim women, created more repression and more discrimination, but in both cases has operationalized an impediment to their claiming more autonomy from within the group, because there is a sentiment among them that they have to prove their solidarity with the group that's being, against whom there is an offensive by the dominant ideology and the powers that be. Thank you.